And Scott, over to you.
Thank you, Imran Bhai. Did I see a floating microphone on this table somewhere? No? Is there one? If not, no worries. Yes, somebody does have one. Okay, because if anybody mind, I like to pace when I talk. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the introduction. I've given a stump speech on more 25, 30 times around the United States, usually to a crowd of people. The last time I gave this crowd of people, gave this introduction, this book introduction, it was at my parents' retirement home. So imagine a crowd of people that may be moderately, pretty well educated. They read the New York Times, but they're Americans and they might not be able to find Bangladesh on the map. And this is obviously quite a different crowd. So I'm a little bit intimidated. No, maybe not intimidated, not nervous, cautious. Cautious and excited. Yes, exactly. So, introduction. In the year 2011, my name is Scott MacMillan. In the year 2011, I joined the BRAC family of organizations. I was a freelance journalist at the time, and I was making my way around Africa as a freelance journalist, doing a bit of travel writing, and I kind of got the development bug, if you will. I caught the development bug, by which I mean I just, this curiosity about what works and what doesn't work in international development and poverty alleviation. And I heard about BRAC, which at the time had only a few years earlier started working in Africa. I learned about BRAC. I learned about a job opening at BRAC USA based in New York City. I applied for that job, and for some reason, they gave me that job. I had no previous experience in international development. I had no previous experience even in nonprofit work. I didn't really have much experience in corporate communications. So there I was, handling communications for the world's largest NGO by most measures. For all of North America. Fast forward, I hope you'll get a kick out of this, just a couple of years from there, I met an acquaintance, a friend of a friend, and we exchanged pleasantries. Oh, what do you do? Well, I work for this development organization called BRAC. It's the world's best kept secret, serving over 100 million people in 11 countries at the time. But nobody's ever heard of us. And he says, and I describe a little bit more about the massive scale and scope and breadth of BRAC's work. And he says to me, man, you really got to fire whoever handles your publicity. That was me at the time, for US anyway. So, okay, in the years to come, I developed a rapport with the founder. I became a speechwriter for major speeches and op-eds. He would call upon me, and he was very particular, as many of you know. He loved the written word, and he was very particular about his speeches. And we would sit for hours at a time working on his speeches, either up on the 19th floor here, or in hotel rooms in New York, in Des Moines for the World Food Prize. We went to Miami, and so I got a lot of FaceTime with him, and I heard him tell stories, many of them from the last 8 decades of his life. A few things I noticed about Abed Bhai. He was not a self-promoter. In fact, as many of you know, he wasn't really good at marketing. He wasn't good at communications, and he would not mind me saying this if he were here today. He did not really believe too much in the value of self-promotion. He believed in keeping your head down and focusing on the work and letting the work speak for itself. That is unusual for a nonprofit leader. I also noticed that he had a way of telling the BRAC story. In America, we have the concept, I mean, you have it here too, I'm sure, the concept of the elevator pitch. Right? You only have a few minutes, if that, seconds really, to make an impression on people, especially in Silicon Valley. It's all about, the elevator pitch. Well, to hear the story of BRAC, so massive in microfinance, tens of thousands of community health workers, tens of thousands of schools, the world's largest non-governmental, non-religious school system, majority girls in every classroom, the community health workers deliver, etc. And don't forget the social enterprises. Oh, don't forget the university and the research hubs at the university. By this point, the elevator has, gone to the top floor and is on its way down again. You've missed your opportunity. And yet, what I noticed, and it took me a while to figure this out, to be honest, there was an underlying unity to everything that Abed was doing, going all the way back to the 1970s. And I came to believe it was the central driving conviction of his life. And it was this idea that hope itself could help people, it's not a silver bullet, could help people break the poverty trap. Hope and agency. So not just the hope that the future could be better, but that there is something that you can do in your own life, things you could do large and small to bring about a better future. That in itself has a power. I'm going to tell a couple of stories from the book right now. I'm not going to read from the book because I'm told I'm not very good at that. I read too quickly and I don't know. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of stories that illustrate that point. The first story from the book is not an anecdote about Abed Bye. It is a biography, but in keeping with a man who did not really enjoy telling stories about himself particularly, I chose to begin the book with the story of a woman named Shohida Begum. She was a participant, one of the first participants in the first cohort, in fact, of the first pilot of what later became known as the graduation program or the graduation approach. She lives way up in the far north in what I call the panhandle of northern Bangladesh, Rangpur division, which juts up into India. This is where she lives on a tributary of what the Indians call the Brahmaputra River. It occurs to me in some respect, and this is how I describe Bangladesh to a crowd of people that maybe don't understand much about its geography and culture. This is, in a sense, geographically speaking, the beginning of Bangladesh, right? Because the mighty Brahmaputra flows in from India, and it's 7 miles wide at this point, even though it's hundreds of kilometers from where it pours into the Bay of Bengal. And it splits out into 100 different tributaries and distributaries. These mighty rivers making their last few hundred miles to the sea is really what defines Bangladesh geographically, right? What is Bangladesh? I will tell an American audience. It is a flood-prone patch of land the size of the U.S. state of Iowa, on which half the population of the United States, about 2% of humanity, lives. And you have these shifting islands, the rivers shift, the land shifts. The soil, much like the language and the culture, is exceptionally fertile, and yet life for a great many is also exceptionally uncertain. Shohida Begum lives on one of these tributaries. And we meet in front of her house, which is about the size, a mud brick dwelling about the size of a pickup truck. The first thing I notice about her is how loudly she speaks. I mean, she yells when she talks. So we just got over World Cup season. Anybody remember the World Cup from 2010 in South Africa? Remember the little horns, the vuvuzelas, the loudest thing you could possibly... Her voice was like a vuvuzela, so I'm not going to imitate it right now. But basically she says to me, "You're not from my land. You're not from here. You don't understand what things used to be like. People could barely afford to put food on their plates. They wore nothing but scraps." And she proceeds to tell me her life story. Now, those of you that have studied the graduation program or work in development will probably, know the contours of this story already. She was married off at the age of 11. Unlike many other girls in that situation, she actually entered a relationship, entered a marriage which she described as, she used, in Bangla, she used the word love. She said, we were very poor, but there was a lot of love in our relationship. My husband was a good man. He sold hats in the market, wove together the conical shaped hats that you see from dried reeds and palm fronds for a few pennies. And that was their sole means of livelihood. One day, and she describes, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was an exceptionally hot day in July 2001. He came back from the market and he collapsed and died. Could have been heat stroke, could have been any number of underlying medical conditions that basic care could have addressed. As it was, she was left penniless. She describes going to the local brickyard and being paid literally the equivalent of pennies per day. The most she ever made was the equivalent of about 50 US cents. Back-breaking work. She describes not eating for 3 days until the folks from the BRAC graduation program came to town. Now, she then proceeds to tell me this this tragicomic story about her goats. They gave her a gift of 3 goats. 3 goats became 12 goats, and then one day the fox came to town. So, spoiler alert, the name of the chapter is The Fox That Killed My Goat. The goat doesn't do too well in the encounter. And she said, when the fox killed my goat, I don't know where the tears came from. I couldn't stop crying. And the BRAC Bai, the case officer, pulled her aside and said, look, we will get through this. You had 3 goats, then you had 12 goats, now you have 11 goats, okay? We're gonna get through this. And she said, I just kept crying and crying and crying and crying, and I went to the branch office, and I made a huge scene there. It was like all business stopped at the branch office because I couldn't, you don't understand, she said. It wasn't just a goat, it was my goat. And a couple of things occurred to me. One is that rising from navigating the pathway out of poverty, it's like walking on the sharp edge of a knife for somebody like Shohida. Any setback, a bad harvest, a single dead goat seems like the end of the world. And it also occurs to me the confidence with which this woman speaks to me. I said how loudly she speaks, and she speaks with such... Oh, there's one more thing. This was shortly after the Holy Artisan Bakery tragedy, and the last time I saw her, I was given a police escort. She starts yelling at the cops. She says, you never come here. You never show your faces around here. You don't have to show your faces around here because everybody gets along. That's why you never, ever come here. And I'm like, lady, okay, you don't yell at the cops in the United States. Who is this woman with this confidence? She speaks with sassing the police, speaking with the confidence of somebody who has overcome great odds. And I look at this woman and I think about the stories that she has told. Not eating for 3 days, being half starved, no livelihood whatsoever, eating scraps. How did she get from there to here? Now, logic, common sense might suggest, well, of course she's confident. She's risen from poverty. She has 3 acres of land now. She doesn't just have goats. She has 12 chickens. She has a cow. The last time I visited, she had bought a milk cart, which she's renting out for a little bit of extra cash in the village. Her situation keeps on getting better and better. The material changes in her life have been vast, and therefore she's a whole lot more confident. The more I read about this, the more I understand that there is an increasing body of economic research that suggests the causality might also flow in the opposite direction. Right? She rose from poverty because of her confidence. And she rose from, she got that confidence from the solidarity she felt from, for instance, the BRAC caseworker who said, we're going to work through this, but also her neighbors that were there to support her at the time. And this idea of hope and confidence helping people rise from poverty is something that I try to explore in this book through the lens of one man's remarkable life. Now, I want to say this, to be sure. This is a potentially misleading idea. It is a potentially dangerous idea. This idea that hope can help people overcome poverty, because it risks creating the impression that somehow Shohida's poverty was self-inflicted, as though all that she really needed was a good pep talk and, somebody to grab her by her shoulders and shake her and say, "Stop being so fatalist, woman. You'll do fine." No, anybody that knows anything about the barriers that people face, especially women, the oppression, the exploitation, will know that that is plainly not the case. And yet, we also do tend to see that when you provide the goats, the microloans, the training, the agricultural inputs, you also see a great deal of sliding back into destitution if you don't also address the underlying psychosocial, if you will, constraints that people face. So, and I do believe, this is me talking, this isn't Brack's opinion, I don't think, maybe others share it, but I think this is one of the things that Brack does well. It addresses the underlying sense of despair that people may feel, while also addressing the material and economic constraints of poverty. I also begin to understand that although this, we see a lot of research from the likes of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, who won the Nobel Prize in 2019, but not just them, many others, that explore the power of hope. This is not a recent idea. This was not a recent idea for Abed Bai. This actually has its roots in his early experience with Brack. So I'm going to tell one more story to try to bring that out, and then we can have a chit-chat about it. So the year is 1974. Abed has already been working for a couple of years now, and he's seen a number of, he's working up in Shala. Obviously the poverty is grinding. Landless people with a very, very extremely high rate, 90% in most areas, rate of illiteracy and innumeracy. He's seen a number of setbacks, he's seen a number of programs fail, but he's begun experimenting with a new way of teaching people basic skills like reading and writing. And this is a methodology that is based on the techniques of a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was an intellectual superstar in the 1970s. His star may have faded for some in the decades that followed, but never for Abed Bai. He would have called himself a Freirean to the end. The Freirean methodology adapted to the Bangladesh context went something like this. Just focus on one word a day and make sure you explore what that word really means in the context of people's everyday lives. So the first day, the first word is house or home, bari in Bangla. And you see imagine a poster, right? And the word is written, and because people are illiterate, there's also a simple sketch of a house. What does the word really mean in the context of people's daily lives? People would gather in the village, and the teacher was more like a facilitator who asks provocative questions, and people would say, well, it's not just a house, it's a home, as they say. Bob Dylan said that. It also means the homestead, right? It means my family, and if I have livestock, if I'm fortunate enough to have any. Are all homes the same? No, mine has a huge hole in the thatch of the roof. It rains right through it during the monsoon, and right under my bed I get wet at night. Why don't you fix it? Well, because I don't have enough money. Why don't you have enough money? Because I'm poor. Why are you poor? Because my wages are so low. Who sets your wages? People begin to scratch at the sort of the nature of poverty itself. They begin to scratch the surface of these types of discussions. They get quite animated. Okay, that's the first day. Second day, Bagh, tiger. What does this really mean? What does this represent? And people will say, well, it's a fierce thing from the wild. It represents the untamed state of nature, if you will. If you see a tiger, go back to your home, right? And then the teacher slash facilitator would ask, well, can a tiger build a house? And people would say, no, of course not. A tiger, if it starts to rain, he can just run under a tree. Can you build a house? And people would say, yes, of course. We can all build houses for ourselves if we have the tools and the material. And the teacher slash facilitator would then say something like this. So the tiger is different from the human being because the tiger can adapt himself to nature, whereas the human being, so the tiger can only adapt himself to nature. The human being can adapt nature to suit his or her own needs. And this process of adapting nature to suit our own needs is called the process of civilization, and we all participate in that process in one way or another. So can anybody here say a little bit about what creative things they might have done to participate in that civilizing process, if you will? And somebody might say, no, I planted some seeds, I harvested some rice, I fixed the hole in the thatch on the roof, right? I worked on a flood wall to direct the flow of rainwater, to irrigate the fields properly. And slowly the point starts to become clear, which is that society is theirs to own and to shape. It is not something given to them. And poverty itself is not something ordained by a higher power. It is not their fate to be poor. There are things that they themselves can do to bring about a better future. Poverty itself was made by humans. It could be unmade by them too. And that there were things that they could do to work together to bring about a better future. Remember, 100 tigers cooperating with one another still could not build a house. But men and women working together could accomplish many things. Abed was not a particularly great storyteller, but I remember him telling me that story for the first time, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, somebody ought to write a book about that. The way he told it, the spark of hope had been lit, and that became a flame, and when those flames started to burn, they became very difficult to extinguish. So here we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott. I should have